There is an old saying among the land measurers and fen men of the low country, that the ground cannot lie though every map that is drawn of it may, that a man with a bought pen may drown a good acre upon paper, and dry a bog with a figure, may shrink a great field with a lying chain, and sink a rich level below the watermark with one stroke of the pen, and make the whole read fair and lawful and signed and sealed, but that the land itself keeps its own reckoning under all of it. For water will find the true level in the end, whatever the plan may swear. And an acre is an acre, though 100 gentlemen certify it a rood, and the whole art of an honest surveyor is to trust the ground before the paper, and to remember that a fine estate map, with a great man's name lettered in the corner, is worth nothing at all if the land beneath it could not lie the way the map has sworn it lies. Margaret Ashworth, Meg, to the few below stairs who were fond of her, had read to the old, housebound Dowager Duchess of Aldermere for 11 years, and no one above the rank of housekeeper had troubled to learn her name. She was 40 when the story properly begins, a spare, plain, quiet woman with careful ink-stained fingers and a still gray gaze that could hold the shape of a field in her eye long after she had turned from the window. She had been born over a surveyor's drawing board in the low fen market town of Wexholm, where old John Ashworth had surveyed and mapped, for the gentlemen and drainage boards of half a wet county, the fields and fens by which the propertied of England reckoned their acres and rents, and she had learned her whole trade at his side before she could keep house, carrying the far end of his brass chain across sodden meadows, and by the time she was grown, computing an area so exactly he would set her figures against his own and find no fault. She had learned, too, the darker half of the craft, as a physician knows poisons, how an acre may be stolen with a short chain, a level made to lie by a false benchmark, a plan drawn to leave good ground off the paper, and how the figures of a rigged survey, however smoothly they read, never in the end close upon themselves. She fetched the dowager's cushions and read her the long, dull estate papers her stiffened eyes could no longer manage, and sat the long afternoons in the corner of the morning room, while the great of the county were served their tea, and never once looked at the gray woman by the window. She was the person the household thought of, when it thought of her at all, as one thinks of the clock on the stair. What the household said behind its hands was uglier, and she knew it. For a plain, penniless woman may be 100 harmless things in a great house, and no one remark it. But let her be seen twice in a fortnight in the same room as an unmarried duke, and the county will settle in an afternoon what it would not trouble to ask in a year, that she is a schemer, a fortune hunter who has crept in by the servants' stair and means to creep up by the great one, and that a woman of her age and her empty purse can have no business near his grace but the oldest and most shameless in the world. Margaret had heard the word fortune hunter reach her from behind a fan more than once in the 11 years, and had learned to let it break over her like weather off the fen, but she had never grown a skin so thick that it did not each time cost her something. The afternoon the new Duke's great decision came properly up to the house. She was in the morning room, with a portfolio of the old estate plans open on her knee, sorting the maps the dowager liked looked over on a wet day, and did not think herself concerned in it at all. "You'll not have heard, I'll wager," said Nan Tibbet, the under housemaid grown to a quick parlor maid, hanging in the doorway with her cap askew. "It's all over the hall. Mr. Faulkner the agent's been shut up with his grace since noon, and Sir Rowland Gaunt's carriage in the yard again, and it's settled at last. His grace is to sell off the whole of the great fen, and the marsh to Sir Rowland, the whole drowned end of the estate, all that worthless wet waste out past the causeway, to pay off the old debts. Signs it within the month, they say. A mercy to be rid of it, Mr. Faulkner says, for it never brought in a shilling and never will, being all bog and reed and standing water fit for nothing but frogs. Isn't it a queer thing, Miss Ashworth, to sell off a whole third of a dukedom and everybody glad of it? It is a great deal of the Hall's business, and none of mine, said Margaret, without lifting her eyes from the plan she was smoothing flat, and none of yours either, Nan. Though I never yet knew that stop a soul. His Grace has not shut himself up with his agent to be second-guessed by the woman who reads his grandmother the terriers. Go and carry her Grace's barley water up while it's warm, and leave the poor man his business. It'll be no lighter for being turned over in the still room. They do say it's the only way clear, Nan went on, undeterred, twisting her apron. His Grace came into naught but debts, poor gentleman, and 100 tenants looking to him, and this way he pays the worst of it off at a stroke, and keeps the good land and the good farms whole. And Sir Rowland's that obliging about it, takes the worthless marsh off his hands, and asks near nothing for the favor, and him a great improving gentleman that sits on the drainage board and knows more of wet land than any man in the shire. Everybody says how handsome it is of him to trouble himself with a drowned bog nobody else would give a crown for. Does everybody say so? Said Margaret, and now she did look up, mild and gray and level. A survey is only a paper, Nan, and a paper is only as true as the ground it was truly taken on, whatever hand is at the foot of it, and whatever the agents swear in the hall. I have seen a deal of drowned land in my time, and some of it was worth nothing, and some of it was worth a fortune to the man who knew the difference and could hold his tongue about it, and it is a strange thing how often the man buying a worthless bog for near nothing is the one man in the county who knows most of what wet land may be made to yield. But there, that's an old surveyor's daughter talking, and no comfort to his Grace. Her Grace's barley water. Go, in those weeks the household learned its new master sidelong, in scraps carried up to the morning room. He did not bluster. A blustering master can be managed, but a quiet exacting one keeps his own counsel. He had come into the title but a year and some months since, and come into it by a road no one had looked for, being a second son who had never been reared to it, his only brother. The heir, a bright laughing soldier, had fallen in the war abroad, and the old Duke his father, who had loved that elder boy past the common measure, had not outlived the news by a 12-month, but had dwindled and grayed and died. Some said of a broken heart, and some of a broken purse, and most of both together. So the title and the debts and the 100 dependent families had come down all at once upon Nicholas, the quiet younger son who had been bred to nothing grander than a small living or a regiment, and who woke every morning of that first hard year with the sense of a man set to steer a great foundering ship he had never been taught the working of, and no brother at his side, and no father, and no one he dared show the fright to. For the estate he had inherited was a proud carcass. The old Duke, open-handed and unlucky, had mortgaged and borrowed against better years that never came, and the interest ran on like a tide that would not turn, and the young Duke, going grimly through the books with his agent, had found only one asset left unpledged and saleable that might, at a stroke, buy off the sharpest of the creditors and steady the whole, the great fen of Aldermere, that broad drowned reach of marsh and reed and mere beyond the causeway, near a third of the estate's whole compass on the map, and worth, by every survey and every account and every man's plain eyes, almost precisely nothing. It had lain drowned and useless past living memory. The rentals set it at a few pounds of eel rents and fowling. The old survey called it hopeless bog. And Sir Rowland Gaunt, the estate's nearest neighbour, whose own good acres marched with the fen along the causeway, had come forward with the kindest offer in the world, to take the whole worthless waste off his young neighbor's hands and pay him a fair round sum for the freehold of it, more indeed than the drowned stuff could be thought to fetch, purely, he said, and said it handsomely, at the Duke's own table, out of neighborly wish to see a fine young man clear of his father's troubles and firm in his seat. It was all very smooth and very kind, if you did not look too near. The young Duke had only to sign away the drowned third of his birthright that had never earned a shilling, and the worst creditors were paid, and the good farms and the good tenants were safe, and a decent neighbor was obliged. He was, by every account, resolved to do it, and to do it with a heavy private sense of failure, that he was the Duke of Aldermere who had begun his stewardship by selling off a third of Aldermere, but resolved, because the alternative was to keep a worthless bog and lose the farms and the families with it. And a man who will not sell a drowned acre to save a living tenant is no fit lord for anyone. He was that manner of man. It did him honor, and it was going to ruin him, and he had not the smallest notion of either. And in those same weeks Margaret Ashworth had been doing the thing that, all unknowing, was making her the one person in England who could stop it. She had been reading the old Duchess her estate plans. For the Dowager Duchess of Aldermere, the young Duke's grandmother, 80 and near enough, and housebound these 3 years with a rheumatism that had stiffened her hands to claws but left her wits as bright and sharp as a needle, had taken it into her head that year to have the old maps and terriers of the estate read and looked over to her of an afternoon, the great parchment surveys, and the tithe maps and the field books going back beyond her own long memory. She could no longer manage the crabbed old hands and the fine ruled plans herself, and so, afternoon upon afternoon that spring, Margaret had sat at the old lady's knee with a portfolio open across both their laps, tracing out for her the fields and the boundaries and the acreages, reading her the field names and the rents, and, being what she was, she had not merely read them, she had seen them, and come to know the whole shape and lie of the Aldermere lands as intimately as she knew her own small history. And more than the maps, she had come to know the Dowager's memory, which was a stranger and a truer map than any on the parchment. That is all wrong, what they have drawn there, the old lady had said one afternoon, rapping a stiff knuckle on the parchment where the great fen lay marked in the flat blue grey wash the map-makers used for drowned waste. That was never all water in my day, Ashworth, whatever the survey says now. I was a girl in this house 60 years since, and we drove out over the causeway to the fen every summer of my girlhood, and there was hard grazing on it, and hay got off it, and geese upon it past counting, and I have skated the meres of it in a hard winter with my brothers, on good firm droves between, that are all marked bog on that map as if they had never been. It drowned, they tell me. It went under in my son's time, and none knew rightly why, and the survey was made after, and there it lies. Worthless. But it was not always worthless, girl, and a thing that changes is a thing that had a reason, and I never in my life trusted a piece of ground that got poorer the year a clever neighbor began to want it. And she had turned her clouded, missing nothing eyes on Margaret, and said, "You have your father's trade in you, they tell me below stairs. Look at it. Tell me what you see." And Margaret Ashworth had bent her grey head over the great survey of the great fen, in the clean window light, to look at the drowned land as she was bidden, and read what she was shown, because she could not help it, because a plan under her eye was a thing she read to the marrow whether she willed it or no. And what she saw, that first quiet afternoon, was a small cold wrongness that she said nothing of to the old lady, because it was too slight to trouble her with and too large to be easy about. She saw that the survey called the fen a bare 90 acres of drowned waste, and she ran her eye, from long habit, round the plotted boundary the surveyor had himself set down. The chained lengths of every side, marked fair along the margins in his own figures. And something in the trained back of her mind that had cast 10,000 such sums at her father's elbow said at once, before she had done more than glance, those lengths do not enclose 90 acres. Those lengths enclose the better part of 500. A boundary is a promise a survey makes to itself, and the acreage is the keeping of it. And here the promise and the keeping did not answer one another by a hair, but by a country mile. Either the surveyor could not compute the plainest figures of his own trade, which no man is engaged to survey a dukedom who cannot, or the acreage had been written down not from the ground, but from what somebody wished the ground to seem. She looked longer, and the wrongness grew. Along the eastern edge, where the parchment showed the boundary running straight and blue beside Sir Rowland Gaunt's own land, there was a queer plain honesty of a straight line where every other margin of the drowned country wandered as drowned country does, as though a whole tract behind that edge had been left off the plan. The map ruled off short, and the missing ground quietly gathered to the far side of the line, and the levels, the heights of the land taken against the fall of the great outfall drain that carried the country's water to the sea, swore that the whole fen lay drowned below the outfall's own bed, so that no water could ever be got off it, and no drainage in nature could dry it, a sink that must forever hold its water because it lay beneath the only door the water had to leave by. That was the whole case for its worthlessness. And Margaret, who had taken 10,000 levels across just such country holding her father's staff in the wind, looked at that column and felt the cold go quietly down her arms. For she had walked the causeway herself on her free afternoons, and she did not believe those heights. The land did not carry itself, to her eye and her feet, like land that lay beneath the water. It carried itself like land drowned on purpose, that could be dried the same way. She said not one word of it to the old Duchess, but folded the plan away and read her the field names off the terrier in her low, even voice, her plain gray face as empty as the clock on the stair. For a thing once truly seen by Margaret Ashworth was seen for good, and she could not unsee that the boundary and the acreage did not answer, that a false straight line ran where a drowned edge should wander, and that a column of levels had sunk a country she did not believe was sunk. So that when the errand fell to her, some weeks after, it fell into the one pair of hands in the county already loaded, unawares, with everything needed to spring the trap. It fell to her by the plainest chance in the world, which is how the largest things in a life generally come. The dowager, who missed nothing spoken near her chair and had the whole business of the sale from her maid within the hour, took it into her head that she would know the truth of what her grandson was signing away, stiff hands or no. They are selling off the fen, Ashworth, she said, rapping her stick against the fender. The whole drowned third of it, to Rowland Gaunt, that has wanted it since before that boy was breeched, and got his father to let it him cheap in the bad years, and now would have the freehold and be done. My grandson thinks it worthless, the survey says worthless, Faulkner says worthless, and I, who skated it as a girl, say a piece of ground that turns worthless the very year a sharp neighbour begins to covet. It wants a second pair of eyes before it is signed away forever. My hands will not hold a glass, and my knees will not carry me over the causeway, but you can. They are to have the old survey out on the map-room table on Thursday, before His Grace signs. You get my leave, and go down as my eyes, and look at this famous worthless survey with your father's trade in your head, and come back and tell me plain whether my grandson is selling a bog or being robbed of a birthright. Tell them I said so. It is not my place to be in the map room while his Grace's agent is at his business, your Grace, said Margaret quietly, though something had gone very still and attentive in her at the word robbed. They'll not thank you for sending your reader down to peer over the agent's shoulder at a gentleman's bargain. They'll do as I bid them or answer to me, said the old lady, rapping the stick, for I was mistress of this house before that boy's father was thought of, and there's not a soul under this roof, Duke or no Duke, forgets it while I am above ground. You'll go, Ashworth. You have a better eye for a plan than any man Faulkner ever hired. I have watched you read those old parchments to me all the spring, and name me a field by its shape before ever you came to its letters. Well, go and look at the shape of my grandson's fen, on this paper they would sell it by, and tell me if it is truly the shape of the ground. The map room at Aldermere ran off the great library at the south front of the house, a bright high room of tall arched windows and polished oak, ranked the length of it with the ranked plan drawers and the pigeon-holed rolls of parchment, and along one wall the brass-bound strongbox where the family's deeds and charters were kept, and through its southern windows a man could see clear away over the causeway to the low gray shine of the fen itself, lying flat to the horizon under the wide fen sky. Margaret had never in 11 years set foot in it. She came in on the Thursday with the dowager's warrant plain in her mouth, and stood by the door with her hands folded. A gray plain woman they none of them had thought to see. There were 3 men about the long baize table, the great survey unrolled and weighted flat in the light before them. The agent, Mr. Faulkner, she knew by sight, a dry, anxious man who plainly wished the awkward errand of the grandmother's reader anywhere but in his tidy mourning. The tall, still man at the head of the table she knew for the Duke, a spare, dark man of perhaps 34, with a fine grief-worn face and cool gray eyes that turned on her with a weary, closed patience. And the third, standing easy and proprietary over the plan with one broad ringed hand spread flat upon it, a florid, well-fleshed, handsome gentleman of about 60 with pale, shrewd eyes and the loud, confident ease of a man who has never in his life been contradicted by anyone who mattered. She took for the neighbour the hall spoke of, Sir Rowland Gaunt, the great improver, the drainage commissioner, whose kindness in buying the worthless bog the whole county was busy admiring. Her Grace's woman, said the Duke, when Faulkner had murmured her errand, in a low, level, exact voice, with no warmth in it, and no unkindness either. My grandmother wishes her own eyes at this, it seems, and sends yours. Well, she is entitled. The fen was Aldermere before it was mine to sell, and she has skated it, she tells me, which is more than I have done. Look your fill, then, and carry her up whatever comfort you can find in it, though I fear there is little but a sad plain sum that must be paid. And he stood back a half-step from the table, weary and courteous, and let her come to the plan. Sir Rowland Gaunt smiled, a broad, indulgent smile, and turned the great parchment an inch toward her with one finger, as a man turns a picture book toward a child. Do not distress yourself over the survey of it, my good woman, he said kindly. It is a melancholy business, but a plain one, and no reflection on anybody. I have known that fen these 40 years. My own land marches with it. More's the pity, for the water off it plagues my drains every winter, and I promise you there is not a sadder or a soggier piece of ground in the 3 ridings. Drowned past all mending, lies below the outfall, do you see, there in the levels, so the water can never be got away. A man might pour a fortune into cuts and engines and never win a dry acre of it. I am taking it off his Grace more from neighbourhood than from sense, if the truth be told. But there, assure her Grace it is all quite regular and quite hopeless, and the kindest thing is to let it be done quickly. And he turned back, comfortable, to the Duke. and Margaret Ashworth bent over the great survey, in the clean south light, to look at the shape of the ground. And it was the levels that stopped her, but not for the reason Sir Rowland so kindly supposed. The whole case lay there fair before her, and it was to her eye all one long quiet lie, told in the two tongues a survey has. The boundary lengths stood honest along the margins, chained figures the surveyor had been obliged to set down truly because a chained line can be walked, and they enclosed, as she had known from the first afternoon, near 500 acres, however the docket swore to a bare 90. And along the east, beside Gaunt's land, ran that straight false margin where a drowned edge should wander, cutting off she could not yet say how much good ground beyond the paper's edge. But it was the column of levels that turned her cold, for she saw the trick of it, which was the cleverest thing on the sheet. The levels had been taken, the survey said, from a benchmark cut on the sill of the fen chapel on the causeway. And she knew that chapel, and its sill did not stand where the survey put it. The whole column of heights had been reckoned down from a mark set a full 7 feet lower than the true sill, so that every honest height on the fen came out 7 feet too low, and land that lay above the outfall and could be drained like a wrung cloth was sunk, on paper, into a bog that never could. One false figure at the head of a true column, one lie about where a chapel sill stood, and the whole rich reclaimable country drowned itself obediently down the page. She said not one word of any of it. She straightened and folded her hands, and made her plain gray face as empty as the clock on the stair, and she said only, "I thank you, your grace. It is a great deal of surveying, and I have looked at it as her grace bade me. I will carry her up what I have seen," which was the exact and entire truth, and told them nothing at all. "There's a sensible creature," said Sir Rowland comfortably, already reaching for his gloves. "Assure the old lady it is all quite regular. The sooner signed, the sooner his grace sleeps easy." But the Duke of Aldermere, an observant man under his grief, had seen something cross the gray woman's face in the half-second that she leaned over the levels and looked from the parchment to the fen, through the window, and back. A stillness, a going cold, a flick of the eye out to the real ground and in again, that he could not name, and it stayed with him oddly after she had gone. The first small crack in the smooth gray wall the agent and the neighbour had built about him. She did not go straight up to the dowager. She went to her own narrow room and sat on the edge of the bed a long while, turning it over, the way her father had taught her to turn a doubtful survey over before ever she let her tongue accuse it, granting it every chance to prove itself honest, because the worst thing a reader of ground can do, worse than missing a fraud, is to cry fraud on an honest survey and break an innocent man, as an innocent man had once been broken for the want of that caution, and had died of it, and had been her father. She granted the survey every chance. Perhaps the surveyor was a fool who could not sum his own lines. Perhaps the straight east edge was a true fen bank. Perhaps her own memory of the chapel sill was at fault. She pulled each thread and gave it every grace, and at the end the thing stood exactly where it had stood, cold and unarguable in the middle of her, and she knew, as surely as she had ever known anything at her father's board, that a piece of good drainable land the size of a small parish had been drowned upon paper by a man paid to drown it, to make a great birthright look a worthless bog so that somebody might buy it for the price of the frogs upon it. She went up to the dowager that evening and gave her the truth, but carefully, because it was a terrible thing to say aloud and more terrible to be wrong in. "I have looked at the survey, your grace, as you bade me," she said low, at the old lady's knee. "And I will not tell you the fen is worthless, for I do not believe it is, and I have never yet lied to you about a plan. But neither can I prove it before any court or any commission from one look across the agent's table, and until I can, it were a wickedness to say more, even to you. For the naming of a fraud is the breaking of the man that made it, and one must be sure past all doubt before one breaks a man. There is a wrongness in the acreage, and a wrongness in a boundary, and a wrongness in the levels that I dare not yet swear to. Give me leave to go and be sure. That is all I ask, and leave to be sure the slow honest way, on the ground, and not on my own quick eye, which is the very thing that damns an honest surveyor when it runs ahead of his chain. The old lady was silent a long moment, her clouded eyes turned toward the fire. I knew it, she said at last, very quietly, and for once she did not rap her stick. I knew that fen never drowned itself for nothing. 60 years I have watched this county and its clever, obliging gentlemen, and I know the smell of a kindness that is a theft in a good coat. Her stiffened hand found Margaret's and gripped it hard. You want proof, on the ground. Then go to Sedge. Reuben Sedge, that has been fen reeve of Aldermere 40 years, and knows every drove and sluice of that drowned country, the way you know your letters. He is honest as daylight, and he has said to me more than once that the water on that fen does not go where the fall of the land intends it to, and has given up saying so to Faulkner, who tells him an old marshman is no judge against a commissioner's survey. Put it to him plain, and if there is a true thing to be walked out, Sedge will help you find it. And Ashworth, the grip tightened, do not go to my grandson. Not yet, and not on your own word. You are a companion the whole county calls a fortune hunter, and he is a proud, grieving man with a respected gentleman at his elbow swearing the thing regular. Carry him a charge of fraud against Sir Rowland on nothing but your eye, and he will think exactly what they tell him to, that the designing woman has found a bold new road to his notice. Get your proof first, through Sedge. Then let it be laid before him, so it cannot be called a schemer's tale, which was, almost word for word, the reasoning Margaret had already made in the dark, and it steadied her to hear it in another mouth. She found Reuben Sedge the next morning at the little brick Reeves house by the causeway sluice, a broad, slow-weathered man of 65, with a face burned brick red by 40 years of fen weather and pale, patient eyes that had watched a great deal of water go by, mending an eel net across his knees in the doorway. He knew her by sight for the gray woman that read to the old Duchess, and rose and touched his forehead, and plainly wondered what on earth had brought her out over the causeway on her own 2 feet of a working morning. Mr. Sedge, she said, I am Miss Ashworth, that reads to her Grace the Dowager. I have a thing to say to you that is not my place to say, and that you had best forget you heard if I am wrong in it. Her Grace sent me down to look at the old survey of the fen this Thursday, before his Grace signs it away to Sir Rowland, and in the looking at it I saw things I do not like and dare not carry higher, being nobody. And her Grace tells me you have said, these years, that the water on the fen does not go where the lie of the land should send it. I have come to ask you to walk me the ground, and show me where the water goes, for I was bred a surveyor's daughter, Mr. Sedge, and I can read a level and cast an acre, and between your feet that know the fen, and my eye that knows a plan, I think we may find out together a thing that neither of us could find alone. Reuben Sedge set down his net and looked at her a long, slow, still moment out of his pale, weathered eyes. Sit down, mistress, off your feet, he said at last. I have walked this fen man and boy for 50 year, and my father before me, And I have known these 3 winters past that I was walking a lie, and could get no soul to hear me say it. They tell me the water lies below the outfall and can't run off, and I say to them, then how is it, masters, that the far drove past the reed is drier every year I live, and the water, as I've watched off this land my whole life, goes east of a summer night and does not come back, when there's nothing east of it but Sir Rowland's ground and Sir Rowland's new dikes, and they pat me and say the old reeve's memory wanders. My memory does not wander, mistress. The water wanders, and it wanders where it is made to. If you can read what my old eyes have seen and put a figure to it that a gentleman must hear, then God bless you for it, and I'll walk you every yard of that fen from here to the sea bank, and show you where the truth is buried. When will you come? She came at first light the next fine morning, in stout pattens and her plainest gown, carrying under her arm the whole of her inheritance, her father's brass measuring chain in its worn leather roll, his spirit level and his little pocket circumferentor in their fitted box, and his field book, its cover dark with the sweat of 30 years of honest work, its pages ruled and figured in the neat dead hand she had loved before she could read. Reuben Sedge looked at the chain as another man might look at a sword, and said only, "Aye, that'll be the thing," and took the far handle of it as naturally as her father used to, and the 2 of them went out onto the drowned country together in the wide gold light, the old marshman who knew the ground, and the gray woman who knew the paper. And neither of them spoke much, for there was a great deal of walking to do and a great deal to see, and what she found on the fen that long bright day and the 2 days after it was the whole of the thing made plain. Not a suspicion, but a country. Sedge led her first along the causeway edge, where any man riding by from the house would see the fen, and there it was, sure enough, all that the survey swore. A broad, melancholy belt of reed and standing water and black, soft ground, a hopeless drowned waste a furlong deep along the whole road frontage, exactly the worthless bog Sir Rowland had described with such feeling across the Duke's table. "There's your fen, mistress, that the gentry see," said Sedge dryly. "A mile of it kept wet a purpose along the road, and the sluice under the causeway set to hold the water high, just here, where folk drive by, so any man may look out and say, 'Aye, poor drowned stuff,' and drive on. Now come you through it, and mind the plank, and look at what's behind the show." And he led her by a hidden hard-drove, a firm buried causeway of faggot and gravel that no map showed, straight through the wet reed belt, and they came out on the far side, a furlong in from the road, into the broad blaze of the morning. And Margaret Ashworth stopped, and stood still, and felt the whole cold size of it settle on her at once. For beyond the kept screen of reed the drowned bog simply ended, as a curtain ends, and there ran away before her to the far sea bank, mile upon flat, rich mile under the fen sky, the finest drained cornland she had ever seen, black fen soil plowed and hedged and ditched, standing thick with green wheat and blue-green beans, ruled across with straight, clean drains running full and quick and all one way, east toward Gaunt's land, and, away at the heart of it, where no eye from the road could find it, the slow black turning sails of a great drainage engine lifting the fen's water day and night up over the bank and away, and had plainly been lifting it these 20 years. The land the survey swore lay drowned below the outfall and could never be dried was as dry as a threshing floor and bearing a fortune in corn, and had been behind its reed curtain since before the young Duke was old enough to ride. "Now you see it," said Reuben Sedge, very low, standing beside her with his old hat in his hands as a man stands in a church. 20 year I've watched it come dry, a drain a year, a field a year, all masked behind the reed, and all the water stole away east under Sir Rowland's bank in the night when the commissioners don't ride. His corn, mistress, on his grace's ground, his harvest off Aldermere land, carried away quiet by the back droves to Gaunt's own barns these 20 year, and never a peck of it, nor a penny of it come nigh the young duke nor his father afore him, that owns every clod of it and thinks it a bog. And now he'd buy the freehold of it for the price of a wet waste, and have it his in law forever, and no man the wiser. I knew it in my bones and my feet. I never could prove it. Can you? Yes, said Margaret Ashworth, in a voice gone very quiet and very steady, looking out over the stolen harvest with her father's chain heavy on her arm. Yes, Miss Sedge, I can prove every yard of it, and I can prove it so that no commissioner nor lawyer nor great name in England can talk it away, because it is not a matter of my word against Sir Rowland's, it is a matter of the ground, and the ground cannot lie, though he has paid a great deal of money to make it seem to. But we must do it slow, and do it right, and set down every figure fair, so that when it is laid before his grace, it is not a companion's tale, but a survey any honest man may check with his own chain. Take the far handle again. We are going to measure his lie. And they did. Through that long day and the two after it, she surveyed the drowned third of Aldermere as her father had taught her, honestly and slowly, and writing all down. She ran the chain the true length of the boundaries and cast the acres. And where the old survey swore 90, she made it 470 acres and some roods, and the missing tract behind the false east line came out near 200 acres of the best of the drained corn, gathered onto the wrong side of a ruled line and off the estate's own plan. She ran a line of levels from the true sill of the fen chapel, which she found standing a full 7 feet and 3 inches above where the old survey pretended its benchmark lay, and so proved the fen floor stood well above the great outfall, high enough to drain by gravity and engine both, exactly as it visibly was drained. And she walked the new drains and the hidden engine, and traced the water's true road east under Gaunt's sea bank, where a stone had been cut with the Drainage Commission's own mark to make the theft of the water look like lawful work. Every figure closed. It was, when she had inked it fair 3 evenings later, by a single candle. Not a suspicion, but a thing as hard and plain as a milestone, a great and patient fraud. From the false chapel mark up, every foot of it made to rob a dukedom of a third of itself, and call the robbery a kindness. And why do you not simply take it to his grace? Said Reuben Sedge, when she showed him the fair copied survey by his own hearth, and he had turned it in his slow brick red hands as a man turns something holy, if you are so sure. And it is all writ down? Because I am not yet sure enough of the man to break the fraud on, said Margaret. The figures are sure, but a companion who cries fraud against his grace's respected neighbour, and the sale but a week off, and every soul in the county certain she is a fortune hunter. Whose word does the Duke take? Mr. Sedge? A commissioner's survey and a baronet's honour? Or his grandmother's grey reader? He turns me off by dinner, and Sir Rowland burns the false field book and stops his engine for a season and lets the reed grow back over the drove, and his grace signs, and the thing is gone under the water for good, and my proof with it. It must be carried to him by a soul he already trusts, and carried in a way he cannot mistake for a scheme. And there is one such soul, and it is not I, and it is not his agent that has been gulled, and it is not his grandmother that loves me. It is you. You have served this house and its fen 40 years and never told it a lie, and he knows it. Will you carry it up? Not my conclusion, only that his old reeve has seen a thing on the fen he must show his grace with his own eyes before ever he signs, and begs him come down to the map room and look. The rest I will lay before him myself, and stand or fall by. Reuben Sedge was quiet a long moment, looking into his fire, and when he spoke his slow voice had thickened. 40 year, he said, I've held my tongue and touched my hat and watched that water stole away and told myself an old reeve can do nothing against gentlemen. And here's a woman come out over my causeway in her pattens and measured the whole of it in 3 days and asks me only to walk up to the house and say what I've always known. I'll carry it, on my own head, and glad of it. If His Grace turns us both off for it, I'm too old to want another master than the truth. And he rose, slow and grave and suddenly resolved, and pulled on his old coat, and went up to the great house to ask, for the first time in 40 years, to be let speak to a duke. She was sent for within the day. She came into the great map room with her father's field book and her fair survey and her chain and level under her arm, and there stood the Duke of Aldermere by the long baize table, the old survey rolled away and the table bare, and Reuben Sedge grave and twisting his hat by the wall, and no one else, for whatever Sedge had said he had said wisely, and neither the agent nor the neighbour was there. The Duke looked at her a long moment, with his cool, closed, grey eyes, the guarded stillness of a man who has been alone with a great sorrow and a great resolve, and does not care to be interrupted in either. And when he spoke his voice was low and level and exact, with neither warmth in it nor unkindness, only the flat control of a man who has taught himself to give nothing away. You are the woman who reads to my grandmother, he said. Sedge tells me, and Sedge I would believe before any man on this estate, that you have surveyed the fen these 3 days, you and he, and that you say it is not drowned, and not worthless, and that the survey I am within a week of selling it by is a lie. He believes you. Do you know why I have sent for you, and not simply thanked him and gone on? Because of the manner of his believing. He is not a man who is easily got at, and he was afraid, and trying not to be exactly as an honest man is who has carried a truth too heavy for him a long way. That is not evidence, mistress. It is a feeling about an old servant. And I have been these 12 months learning how little my feelings about honest servants are worth against a column of figures. So I will ask you plainly, and you will answer plainly, or you will go back to my grandmother's maps and we will both forget this hour. Sir Rowland Gaunt is the first drainage man in this county, and sits on the commission that governs every foot of that water. His survey is signed and sworn and 20 years old. My own agent calls it regular. What is it that you, who read old plans to an old lady, say you have found that all of them have missed? I have found nothing, Your Grace, that any honest surveyor could not find in a week with a chain, said Margaret. That is the whole strength of it. And the whole of what should frighten you? I have found a question. And it is the one question not a soul in this business has troubled to ask, because every one of them trusted the man who took the survey instead of walking the ground the survey is of. That checked him. He had looked for fright, or fawning, or a wild servant's accusation he could put down in a breath, and she had given him none of the three. A question, he repeated. A survey, Your Grace, is not the ground. It is a set of promises a man makes about the ground, on paper, that another man may check by going and looking. Its acreage is a promise its own boundaries must keep. Its levels are a promise the water itself must keep. And the whole worth of a survey is that these promises can be walked out and proved true or false by anyone patient enough to do it, which is exactly why no one ever does, once a great name has signed it. Sir Rowland's survey makes 3 promises. It promises the fen is a bare 90 acres. It promises the land lies below the outfall and cannot be drained. And it promises, by both, that the whole is a worthless drowned bog. I have walked out all three, your grace, with my father's chain and level, and every one of the three is false. Not doubtful, not arguable, but false the way a sum is false. And I can show you each of them so plainly that you need believe no man's word for it, not Sir Rowland's and not mine, but only your own eyes and your own feet. The map room was very quiet. The Duke of Aldermere stood looking at her, and something moved behind the closed gray eyes, not warmth, but the flat, testing attention of a man who has just heard, from the last quarter he ever looked for it, a note with the unmistakable ring of truth in it. "The levels," he said slowly. "Sir Rowland showed me the levels himself with his own finger. The land lies below the outfall. He said no man could drain it who poured a fortune into the trying. The land lies 7 feet and 3 inches above where his survey pretends to measure it from, your grace," said Margaret, "because his levels are taken down from a benchmark he swears is cut on the chapel sill, and the chapel sill stands 7 feet and 3 inches higher than his figure for it. Move the floor of a house down 7 feet on paper, and every room in it drowns on paper, though the house stands dry as ever in the sun. That is his whole trick, and it is one false figure at the head of a true column, and it is the oldest trick a dishonest leveler knows, and my father taught me to look for it before I could plight my own hair. I have run the line myself from the true sill. The fen lies high enough to drain, and I need not even make you believe my level, your grace, for there is a plainer proof than any figure, that wants no chain and no learning and no trust in me at all. And what is that?" he said. "That it is already drained," said Margaret Ashworth, quietly, "and already bearing corn. The land your survey swears is a drowned bog that cannot in nature be dried is dried, your grace, this minute. Behind the belt of reed they keep wet along your causeway to fool the men who drive by. It is ditched and hedged and plowed and standing thick with this year's wheat. And there is an engine turning at the heart of it that has been lifting your water over Sir Rowland's bank for 20 years. You cannot argue with a field of corn. It does not care whose survey says it should be under water. It is only there, growing, on the ground he has told you is worth nothing, and it has been carried to his barns every harvest of your life and your father's, off your own land. While you were taught to think it a bog, you should thank him for taking away." The Duke of Aldermere did not move for a moment, and when he spoke the level voice had, for the first time, the smallest catch in it, quickly mastered. "You understand what you are saying to me," he said, low. "You are not merely telling me a neighbour cheated my father over a boundary. You are telling me the thing I have been about to sell as my one worthless burden is the richest land I own, that the debts might be paid off its true rents 10 times over. That I need sell nothing, and turn off no one, and beggar no family, and that I have been within a week of signing the best third of Aldermere over to the very man who has been quietly reaping it for 20 years, and thanking him, and thinking myself honourable for it. Do you know what it is to hold that out to a man in my place and be wrong?" "I know exactly what it is, your grace," said Margaret, very quietly, "for it was done to my own father the other way about. A false hope of a cleared name held out to an honest man and then dashed, and it killed him. I will tell you the whole of that another day, if you care to hear it. It is why I have his chain and his level, and why I cannot leave a lie in a survey lying. But it is why, above all, I will not hold you a hope. I have felt what a dashed hope does to a man. I will hold you a proof, or I will hold you nothing." He was silent a long moment, and she could see him, behind the still gray eyes, doing the thing a proud exacting man does with a hope too large to be borne, holding it off at arm's length, refusing to let himself want it, lest it prove false and break him twice. "You could be mistaken," he said. "An old chain stretches. A level can be read wrong by a tired eye. My whole estate, my father's judgment, my neighbor's honor, and the peace of 100 families cannot be overturned because a companion paced a wet field and thinks the figures do not sum. No, your grace, they cannot and they must not," said Margaret, "and I would think the worse of you if you overturned them on my say-so, for that is precisely the credulousness that let the fen be stolen in the first place. A great man taking a hard thing on trust because the one who told it him wore a good coat. Do not take it on my trust. I am asking you for the contrary of trust. Come down onto the fen at noon tomorrow, with your agent, and with Sir Rowland Gaunt himself, and any honest surveyor you care to send for. And let me lay the survey's 3 promises against the ground before all of you, and prove or fail each where every man can see. Bring a second chain to mine, a second level to mine. And when we have done with the figures, I will walk you all through the reed to the corn, and let the standing wheat say the last word that needs no surveyor at all. If I am wrong in a single stroke of it, you may turn me off your estate the same hour, and I will go without a character and not complain. But I do not think I am wrong. I have been reading ground since before you were breached, and I have never been so sure, nor so sorry to be sure. For it is a black thing, I tell you, of a man who has sat at your table." "Then prove it," he said at last, and something had shifted in the gray eyes, some long-held weight beginning, cautiously, to move. "Tomorrow, at noon, on the fen. I will bring Faulkner, and I will bring a stranger surveyor from the county town who never heard of any of us. And I will send this evening and bid Sir Rowland attend me on the fen on a matter of the sale, and not tell him why. For by God, if this thing is what you say, he shall answer it to my face, and standing on the very ground, and not by a smooth word across my dinner. And if you are right, mistress, then I have been within a week of the ruin of my house, and been saved from it by a woman I did not trouble to look at. And I will owe you a debt I do not know how a duke repays. And if you are wrong, and have raised this in me for nothing, and slandered a man who has been kind to me, I will not forgive it, of you or of myself. Do you understand me?" "Perfectly, your grace," said Margaret Ashworth. "Then let us go and measure the truth, and let the ground be the judge, and not you nor I nor Sir Rowland. Noon on the fen, and bring your stranger and his chain. The ground has been waiting 20 years to be asked an honest question. It will not mind the company." She was right. It is worth saying plainly, because the household did not believe it for a month, and the Duke scarcely let himself believe it for longer, that she was simply, unglamorously right in the way competence is right. The noon came bright and wide and gold, one of those high fen days when the sky is 3/4 of the world, and they gathered on the causeway edge of the great fen, an ill-assorted company on the drowned land's own ground. The Duke of Aldermere stood tall and still and holding himself hard. Mr. Faulkner, the agent, hovered anxious and disapproving, certain his master had been talked into a mortifying folly by a servant. A stranger surveyor from the county town, a spare, shrewd young man named Mr. Pruitt, fetched out at the Duke's charge and told nothing but that he was to bring his chain and his level and check another's figures, waited incurious with his instruments on his shoulder. Reuben Sedge stood by with his hat in his hands, and Sir Rowland Gaunt, sent for on a matter of the sale, and arrived florid and genial in his gig, looked about him at the surveying gear and the grey companion, with her father's chain and the summoned stranger, and something wary moved far back in the pale eyes before the broad smile covered it. He did not yet know from what quarter the wind was coming. He knew only that there was more gear on his causeway than a simple signing wanted, and he was a man who had grown rich by noticing such things. "Your Grace," he said heartily, "what's all this survey tackle? The thing's surveyed to death already, and sad enough surveying too. If you've fetched a new man to value the bog, he'll only tell you what the last three told you and I've told you, that it's the wettest worst waste in the shire and you're well rid of it. Shall we not do our business in the house like Christians, out of this wind?" "We will do it here, Sir Rowland, on the ground, if you will indulge me," said the Duke in his low level voice. "My grandmother's companion has raised a question about the survey, and I have found I would rather have it answered on the fen than in the map room. You know the ground better than any of us. I think you will not object to seeing it settled where it lies." And he turned to Margaret and said, "Only, Miss Ashworth, you have your chain and your level and the whole noon. Say now, before us all, what you have found, and let any man here fault it who can." Sir Rowland Gaunt laughed, a warm, forgiving laugh, and spread his broad, ringed hands. "Your Grace, I confess myself charmed, her Grace's reader. It is very picturesque. But, forgive me, my good woman, the surveying of drowned fen is the work of a lifetime and a science of instruments. I have given 40 years to this water, and sit on the commission that governs it, and I say to you kindly that you are quite out of your depth, which on this ground is easily done. There is nothing here but an old lady's fancy that the fen was better in her day, and a hired stranger who will charge his Grace 3 guineas to confirm what every man knows. But measure away, measure away. I've an hour to spare to humor a great house." And he set his fists on his hips, comfortable, certain, a man who has never once been checked and prepared to be amused. She began. And here is the thing that undid Sir Rowland Gaunt and turned the bright noon by degrees to a dreadful silence. She did not accuse, and did not flourish, and raised her voice not at all. She simply measured the ground, and made every other man measure it too, and let the figures speak. She took first the plainest promise. The acreage. "The survey swears this fen a bare 90 acres, your Grace. 180, she said, and by that smallness it is called a trifle worth selling cheap. But a survey must set down its own boundary lengths truly, for a boundary can be walked, and these it has set down truly, here in its own margins. I ask only that we chain 2 of its own lines and cast its own figures. Mr. Pruitt, you are a stranger to all of us and to this quarrel. Will you take the chain with me that no man may say I stretched or slacked it?" And the incurious young surveyor, shrugging, took the far handle of her father's chain and paced with her the great south boundary and then the east, calling the chains aloud while Faulkner, bidden to it, wrote them down, and the young man's face changed as he went, the professional boredom falling off it, and at the turn of the second line he stopped and did his own quick sum in his head and looked up sharply, first at the figures and then, with a frown, at Sir Rowland Gaunt. "Your Grace," he said, "I don't know what the docket claims, but these 4 sides shut on near 470 acres, or I never cast an acre in my life. There's no 90 here. There's the best part of half a section of land inside these lines." And Sir Rowland's smile stayed on his mouth but went out of his eyes. "That is the first promise," said Margaret quietly, "and it is a lie of near 300 acres. And it is not my lie, your Grace. It is the survey's own boundaries giving its own docket the lie. Any child that can add may check it, and Mr. Pruitt, who never heard of me till this morning, has just checked it. Now the second promise, which is the levels, and which is the cleverer and the blacker. And she set up her father's level on its 3 legs, and had the stranger set up his own beside it. And she ran a line of heights from the sill of the little fen chapel that stood plain on the causeway for any man to lay a staff against. And she showed them, foot by foot, the Duke himself sighting through the glass at her word, and reading the staff with his own eyes, that the chapel sill on which the old survey swore its benchmark was cut stood 7 feet and 3 inches higher than the height the old survey had given it. Here is where they said the floor of the fen begins. Your Grace, she said, chalking the false figure on the chapel wall, and here, chalking it 7 feet above, is where God and the mason and your own eyes say it truly begins. Every height on that old survey was carried down from this false low mark, so that all the land came out 7 feet drowned, that stands 7 feet dry. Mr. Pruitt has his own level there and his own figures. Let him say if I have moved a mark or read a staff wrong. And the stranger, grave now and a little pale, checked his own instrument against hers and said, Lo, no, your Grace. Her level's true and her figure's true. The old survey's benchmark is set 7 foot and better below the real sill. I've seen it done, but I never saw it done so bold. This land lies well above the outfall. It'll drain. It near drain itself. This is fantastical, said Sir Rowland Gaunt, and the hearty voice had thinned and sharpened. A stretched chain and a mislaid benchmark 20 years old prove nothing but that some careless fellow did slovenly work in my grandfather's time, which I never denied. The land is wet, your Grace. You have all seen the reed and the standing water with your own eyes not an hour since, along the whole road. Are we to overthrow a sworn survey and a settled bargain because a serving woman has paced a boundary and quarreled with a dead man's benchmark? I have humored this far enough. The fen is a bog. It has always been a bog. Sign your bargain and be, then walk it with us, Sir Rowland, said Margaret Ashworth. She said it quietly into the wind, and it stopped him as though she had struck him. There is a third promise, she went on, turning to the Duke, and it is the one no figure need prove, because it is not on paper at all, it is growing. The survey swears this is a drowned bog. Behind that belt of reed they keep wet along your causeway, kept wet on purpose, by a sluice set to hold the show water high, just where the gentry drive by. The fen ends, a furlong in, as a curtain ends, and beyond it lies 400 acres of the finest drained cornland in the shire, ditched and hedged and this day standing thick with wheat, and an engine turning that has lifted your water east over Sir Rowland's bank these 20 years. I have walked it, Mr. Sedge has walked it, man and boy. And the plainest proof of all is the shortest. Let us walk through the reed together and stand in the corn, and then let any man here call this ground a worthless bog to the Duke's face if he can. She looked, level and gray, straight at Sir Rowland Gaunt. You know that ground better than any of us, sir. You said so yourself not an hour since. Lead us to it. Walk your neighbor through his own reed and show him the drowned waste you would buy. I will follow at your heel and say nothing, only walk. And Sir Rowland Gaunt looked at the wall of reed, and at the hidden drove mouth Sedge was quietly standing beside, and at the ring of waiting faces, and he did not put out his hand toward the fen, because he knew, as well as she did, what stood a furlong in behind the reed, and the silence of his not walking went round the bright noon like a cold draught off the sea, and was a plainer confession than any words could have been. He had built 40 years of consequence upon his great name and his commissioner's seat, and the certainty that no one beneath him would ever dare go and look. And a plain woman in a gray shawl had asked him to walk a quarter-mile over his own drove into the daylight, and he could not, and every soul on that causeway saw that he could not. "I'll not," he said at last, thickly, "be marched about a marsh at a serving woman's bidding to prove what 40 years and a sworn survey have settled. My word upon that fen stands upon." "Your word, Sir Rowland," said the Duke of Aldermere, and his low voice had gone very quiet and very terrible, "has just declined to walk a quarter-mile across ground you have told me for a year you know better than your own park. I have my answer." And he turned from his neighbour as though the man had ceased to stand upon the causeway, and looked instead at Margaret Ashworth, and something had come up behind the closed grey eyes that was not testing and not wariness, but a stunned and dawning wonder. "Lead on, Miss Ashworth," he said, "through the reed. I will see my worthless bog with my own 2 eyes, and I will see it now." And she led them. The Duke at her shoulder, the stranger surveyor, the aghast agent, old Sedge beaming and blinking, and Sir Rowland Gaunt coming stiff and grey, and last of all, because he dared not stay behind, in by the hidden hard drove through the wet screen of reed, and they came out on the far side of it into the broad blaze of the afternoon, and the drowned bog ended as a curtain ends, and there ran away before them mile upon flat rich mile of black fen soil, hedged and ditched and standing to the knee in green wheat, the straight drains running full and quick all one way, and away at its heart the slow black sails of the great engine turning, lifting Aldermere's water over another man's bank as it had lifted it every day and night for 20 years. And the Duke of Aldermere stood at the edge of his own stolen harvest, with the wind moving the wheat in long pale waves to the sea bank, and looked at it a long time and said nothing at all, and when at last he spoke it was very low, and not to any of them, but to the ground itself, or to his dead father, or to God. "They told me it was worth nothing," he said. "For a year they have told me it was worth nothing, and I have grieved that I must sell it, and thought myself hard used and honourable both. And it is the richest land in the county, and it has been feeding another man's barns off my name since I was a boy." He turned, and his grief-worn face had come alight with a slow and formidable anger, held hard in check. "Miss Ashworth, you have not only told me the survey is false, you have stood me in the middle of the proof and made the corn tell me, so that I need believe no man's word for it, not even yours. This is my land. This was my land while I was being taught to give it away, and I was within a week of signing it, and the tenants I meant so nobly to save by selling it over to the very man who robbed us of it." He mastered himself with visible effort. "Stay, there is a great tangle here, how it was done, and by whose hand the false survey was drawn, and how it is to be proved to a court and the commission, and set right, and the true worth of it restored to the estate, and the tenants' due paid back. And it will want an honest surveyor who cannot be frightened and cannot be bought. And there is exactly one such within my reach, and she reads my grandmother her maps. Will you do it?" "I'll do it, your grace," said Margaret Ashworth, gathering her father's level from its legs, her plain face wet with the wind and something more. "It will take some weeks to trace the whole of it to its root, who drew the false survey for Sir Rowland's fee, and where the hidden drains were let and by whose labour, and how the commission's own mark came to be cut in a bank to make the theft of your water look like lawful work. For a fraud of this size is not one man's doing, and leaves a great many honest witnesses if one has only the patience to find them and the nerve not to be dazzled by a great name. I'll give you back the true worth of your fen, whole and proven, and the tenants their due along with it. Only let it be done in the daylight, every step and every figure open to any honest chain in England, so that no man may ever call it a companion's spite. Sir Rowland Gaunt went back over the reed drove, and off the fen not folded and shabby as a lesser cheat might have gone, but upright and florid and dangerous. And at the causeway, climbing into his gig, he turned and looked at Margaret with his pale, shrewd eyes, and said softly, so that it carried down the wind, "You are a very clever woman, Miss Ashworth, for a lady's companion. It is a pity. Clever women who cannot keep their place are so easily shown to the world for what they truly are, and the world, mistress, will always sooner believe a designing spinster schemed to snare a duke than that a gentleman of 40 years' standing troubled to rob him. Remember that, when your figures are all cast." And he whipped up and was gone, and the threat hung in the bright fen air behind him. And Margaret, who had faced the ruin of her own father and worse, felt it settle cold along her spine, and knew that the man was not done, and that the next battle would be fought not over the ground, which was past all denying, but over her. She thought, standing in the wind at the fen's edge with her father's chain heavy on her arm, well, the first half is done. The truth is up out of the water and cannot be sunk again. And she was right in that. But she thought, too, that she would prove the tangle and restore the worth, and then go quietly back to her Grace's maps and her narrow room and her upper servant's wage, the same grey woman she had always been, and in that she was wrong, and this time for the rest of her life, for she did not go back to the reading desk. She was given the whole tangle to trace and set right, and through the long, bright summer she worked it back to its root. She traced the false survey to the hand that drew it, one Mr. Josiah Quainton, a surveyor of the county town, long since fallen from what little standing he had ever owned, who 20 years before had taken Sir Rowland Gaunt's fee to set his benchmark low and his acreage short and drown a rich country upon paper. She found him in a mean lodging over a rope walk, a ruined, frightened man who had drunk the fee up long ago and lived since in daily fear of exactly this. And when she laid her true survey before him, and named the very 7 feet and 3 inches of his lie, he broke and told the whole of it. He had kept, out of a surveyor's instinct that would not quite die even in a bought man, his true rough field book, the honest first measurements taken before he inked the false fair copy, hidden these 20 years, and that field book, in his own dated hand, standing in flat contradiction to the sworn survey built upon its falsification, was a confession no court could refuse. He gave it up, and swore the whole before a magistrate on the promise he should not hang for another man's greater sin, and named Sir Rowland Gaunt, who had brought him the commission and paid him in banknotes and stood over him while he moved the mark. And so the thing stood whole and proven long before the summer's end, in a sheaf of sworn papers no court could refuse, the false survey, the true field book that gave it the lie, the surveyor's confession, the hidden drains and the engine, the 20 harvests carried off to Gaunt's barns, and the black patient motive under it all. For Sir Rowland Gaunt, respected improver and drainage commissioner, had wanted that fen since he was a young man, and understood, as almost no one else then did, what the new engines could make of drowned land, and rather than offer the old Duke a fair price for a fair survey, he had bought a false one, drowned the birthright on paper, taken it cheap on a long lease as a worthless burden, and then, masked behind the reed, screened by his own commissioner's seat, drained it in secret and reaped it in secret for 20 years, and now, the lease running toward its end and a green, grieving boy in the old Duke's place, had reached out to buy the freehold cheap and make the long theft his own forever. Wrapped to the last in the good coat of a neighbour, doing a kindness. He had reckoned every soul in the business and left out only the one beneath reckoning, the grey woman who read an old lady her maps and happened to know a level from a lie. And through that summer, the Duke came down to the map room in the grey of the morning and the gold of the evening, and asked her questions, and, stranger yet, listened to the answers. And by degrees so small, neither marked the moment, they fell into the strangest intimacy either had ever known, that of two solitary people bent over the same exact, honest, dangerous work, where rank thins to almost nothing, and a grieving man cannot go on pretending that the woman restoring his stolen birthright is beneath his notice. They spread the true survey and the false one side by side on the long baize table, and the old estate maps his grandmother had loved, and worked out together what the fen had been, and was, and might be made, how the drains should run to the estate's own gain now, and the engine's water be turned back honestly over Aldermere's bank, what rents the reclaimed land would fairly bear, how much was owed back, and to whom, and how the fen-edged tenants who had been quietly starved on the shrinking good land these 20 years should have their due of the recovered ground. "They are afraid of me," he said to her one grey afternoon, both of them at the long table, while the rain ticked at the tall windows. "Every soul on this estate. I say a thing, and it is agreed before the words are cold. My own agent let me walk to the edge of ruin rather than tell a duke his neighbour might be a thief, because it was easier. Sir Roland flattered me for a year, and I never once thought to go and look at what he flattered me out of. And you contradict me a dozen times a day, over a rent, over a level, over the reading of a figure, and never once soften it. Why do you not flatter me, Miss Ashworth, when the whole world does?" "Because the whole world wants something of you, your grace, and I want nothing," said Margaret, not looking up from the column she was casting. "A place, a rise, a favour, a fright spared, every flatterer in your house has a reason, and the reason is always themselves. I have a chain and a level and a pair of eyes that know true ground from a lie about it, and the name of Ashworth, which is worth nothing to anybody living but me, and not one of the three is in your gift to give or take away. A person who wants nothing of you is the only soul in the world who can afford to tell you the truth. You would do well to keep one always by you. They are worth more than the first improver in England, and a great deal harder to come by, and they never once send in a bill." He was quiet at that, and she did not see the look on his face, because she had learned young that men say the truest things when they are not being looked at, and presently he told her the thing he had told no one. "I was so ready to sell it," he said, low, staring at the rain. "That is what shames me past the fraud itself. Some part of me almost welcomed the selling. Because if the fen was worthless and I must give it up to save the farms, then my father's ruin of this house had a floor I could reach and mend. I could make one hard, honourable sacrifice and prove myself a fit lord. Doing penance is easier than grief. My brother would have questioned the survey in an afternoon. He questioned everything. It was why the men loved him, and he is under the ground in Spain. And I, who was bred to question nothing and take the good coat's word, came to the title in his place. So when a great man told me my worst land was worthless and offered to take the shame of it kindly off my hands, I did not go and look. You went and looked. You have given me back a third of my inheritance and taken from me the comfortable penance, and left me only the plain work and the plain grief, which are heavier and truer and mine." He turned and looked at her. "I do not know how to thank a person for that. There is no coin for it." "Then do not try, your grace," said Margaret. "I did not do it for thanks. I did it because I could not do otherwise. Because a survey lay upon your grandmother's knee, and cried out to me that it was not the shape of the ground, and I have never been able to leave a lie in a plan lying, any more than you could leave a man drowning in a dike you were passing. My father was the same, and it cost him everything. She set down her dividers. You should know the whole of me, since you have told me the whole of you. My father was an honest surveyor, and he found a fraud once in a great drainage where the commissioner's man was measuring the poor commoners out of their allotments to swell the gentleman's shares, and he reported it as an honest man must. And the gentlemen were believed, being gentlemen, and my father disbelieved. Being a hired measurer, they got a bought remeasurement to prove his figures false, put it about that he had faked his own survey out of spite, and he was ruined and died of it inside 3 years, called a cheat to the last by every soul but me. So when I say I know what it is to hold out a truth and have a great name crush it, I am not speaking at large. I could not save my own father. I found I could not stand by and watch a living duke robbed of 1/3 of his house, and an honest dead one, for your father was gulled, not knavish, written down a spendthrift, when I of all the world could read the level and hold my tongue and be safe. She looked up, gray and steady. That is the whole of me. There is no more. The Duke of Aldermere said nothing at all for a long moment, and when he spoke it was only, very low, "It is a great deal more than most people are, Miss Ashworth," and he did not trust himself to say the rest, and went instead to the window, and stood looking out over the causeway to the far bright shine of the fen, turning something over that he had thought long settled about the sort of woman A man in his place might come to value above all others, for the household had begun to feel the change, and it pleased them a great deal less than it pleased her, since it upset the order of things they leaned upon. Mrs. Pargeter, the housekeeper, jealous of every inch of her standing, took to a cold civility worse than rudeness, and let fall in the servants' hall, meaning to be overheard, that some folk who had come into a great house with one box and a dead disgraced name had grown very grand of late forever shut up with his grace over their maps, and that she knew a fortune hunter's long game when she saw it played, however plain the face, and however clever the tale of drowned corn got up to make herself needful. And the county, hearing that the young duke had broken off the sale of the fen and turned upon his respectable neighbour on the word of his grandmother's paid reader, did not say how brave, it said, over its port, that the designing Ashworth woman had cooked up a wild story of hidden harvests and false levels to slander poor abused Sir Rowland, break the honest bargain, and make the Duke think her a marvel and himself in her debt. The boldest cast for a coronet the shire had seen in a generation, and that they should all watch within the 12-month what she had truly been angling for. Margaret let the whispers break over her like fen weather, and only to Reuben Sedge, walking the drying droves of an evening to plan the honest new drainage, did she say anything of it at all. "They think I did it to catch him," she said, not bitterly, only tired. "Every soul from the still room to the Lord Lieutenant. They cannot imagine I did it, because it was true." "They think," said Sedge, in his slow way, looking out over the corn that was his life's vindication ripening gold to the sea bank, "what small, comfortable folk always think when they see one of the overlooked prove worth more than the whole gilded rest of them, that it must be by some low trick, since it cannot be by plain desert, for if it were desert, then any of the fine gentlemen might have walked out over this causeway any morning of 20 years, and chained a boundary, and read a level, and seen what you saw, and not one ever did. And there is no thought less comfortable to a great man than that one. Pay it no mind, mistress. You have given a living duke back a third of his land and 100 families their bread, and me the sight of my fen come dry and honest again before I die, which all the great folk that now sneer would have watched, sold off forever without stirring a boot. If the county cannot bear the sight of that, the fault is in the county. And he took up his staff and went on down the drove, and left Margaret in the low gold light with a feeling that was not quite fear and not quite hope, understanding for the first time that she stood between two worlds and belonged wholly to neither, a lonely place to stand, and one that would grow lonelier before it grew otherwise. Sir Rowland Gaunt was not so easily done with as a man caught out ought to be. The Duke, unwilling to loose a public scandal upon a neighbour of 40 years standing until the sworn case was iron tight and the commission itself could be made to move, had not yet gone openly to law, and Gaunt, with a lifetime of respected consequence to save, and the pit of the law and the ruin of his commission's seat at his back, spent that summer not in shame, but in building a defence. And his defence, since the ground was past all denying, was not to deny the fraud, but to deny the woman, to have the meddling companion who found it shown a scheming, half-taught fortune hunter, so that no gentleman on the commission or the bench need weigh her word, and the whole discovery might be retold as a designing spinster's plot to break a fair sail and snare a duke. In this he had ready allies, the affronted county gentry, who did not care to think a man they had dined with these 40 years a common thief, and cared still less to be shown it by a servant, and Mrs. Pargeter nursing her grievance, and the whole sweet willingness of comfortable people to believe the worst of a plain poor woman who had risen. He came in the last week of August, when the sworn papers were all but ready to be laid before the commission and the bench, and he came not humbly, but in a bluster dressed as injured innocence, with his cold, proud daughter, Miss Sabina Gaunt, sailing at his side, and a sharp hired attorney at his elbow, resolved to fight where it would do most harm, in the open, before the assembled household, and 2 or 3 of the county gentry he had brought as witnesses to his wrongs, where a plain woman might be shouted down by 40 years of gentility. He swept into the great stone-flagged hall where the Duke stood among his people, and flung out one broad ringed hand at Margaret, who had come down with the sworn survey under her arm and stopped dead at the sight of the gathered room. "Your Grace, I come for justice," he said, loud and rolling. "I have been these 2 months a slandered man. My name, my 40 years' good name on this county's every board and bench, cried down before the whole world, and upon whose word? Upon the word of that woman there, a paid companion, a reader of maps to a bedridden old lady that came into this house with 1 box and a forger's name, for her own father, your Grace, was turned off in public disgrace as a faker of surveys. Ask where you like, it is well known, and who has, out of the oldest ambition of her scheming sex, got up a farrago of stretched chains and paste bogs and a drunkard's bought confession to break a fair and settled sale, ruin the nearest neighbour your family owns, and leave herself the one marvel standing at a duke's elbow. Who ever gave a lady's companion leave to overrule the settled science of gentlemen and commissioners? I demand she be turned off this estate before she blackens it, and me further." "It is God's own truth, your Grace," said Miss Sabina Gaunt, sharp and high, 2 spots of color in her cold cheeks. "A fortune hunter, plain as paint, and a low-born one at that has bewitched a grieving gentleman with a conjurer's tale of hidden corn. There is a name for women who worm their way toward great men by ruining honest neighbors, and it is not a word I will soil my mouth with in this company." And the 2 or 3 brought gentry murmured, and Mrs. Pargeter by the stair foot folded her hands in grim satisfaction, and the whole great hall turned its eyes upon the grey woman by the door, and waited to see her broken. Margaret might have borne it in silence. She had borne a great deal in silence in 40 years. But she saw the Duke draw breath to speak, saw in his face that he meant to fling his whole grief-worn name before his entire household and the watching county, on the side of a paid companion against a baronet of 40 years' standing, and she could not let him. A great man may keep a clever surveyor. He may not be seen to stake his ducal honor on one against a neighbor and a wronged young lady, not without a whisper following him down all his years that his grandmother's grey reader had bewitched him into it. She saw the whole of it in the half-second before he spoke, and stepped forward and spoke first, and headed him off from ruining himself for her sake. "No, your grace," she said. "Let me." And she folded her chain-roughened hands before her grey gown, and faced Sir Rowland Gaunt, and her voice was not loud, but it carried the length of the great hall, because it did not shake. "Sir Rowland, you say I am ignorant, and a schemer, and my father a faker of surveys. My father was an honest man, broken by a lie exactly like the one you have farmed for 20 years, and I will not defend his grave to this company. It does not need me, and neither in the end does yours. You say I did it to catch a husband. Then hear me, sir, before them all. I want nothing in this house that I did not bring into it. I ask no place, no rise, no marriage, no coin above my wage. I claimed one thing only, and I claim it still, that I can tell true ground from a lie told about it, an acre from a rood, a level from a falsehood, and those are not opinions, sir, and they are not a woman's wiles. They are facts, standing in the wheat and cut in the chapel sill and running in every drain out there this minute, and they do not care one farthing whether the eye that reads them sits in a great man's face or a grey woman's." She took a step, and Sir Rowland Gaunt, to his own visible surprise, took one back. "You say I got up a farrago," she went on. "Then send for other eyes than mine. Send for the county surveyor, for the king's own engineers, for any honest measurer in England, and set them on that fen with a chain, as I set the stranger Mr. Pruitt on it before witnesses, who never heard my name till that morning, and cast 470 acres where your survey swears 90. Send them to the chapel sill to find your benchmark cut 7 feet too low. Send them through the reed to stand in the standing corn on the ground your survey calls a drowned bog, and send for Mr. Josiah Quainton, that drew your false survey for your banknotes, and kept his true field book 20 years against this very day, and has sworn the whole of it to a magistrate this fortnight past, and named the gentleman who brought him the fee and stood over him while he moved the mark. It does not need me, Sir Rowland. I found it, but I am not it. You came here to put out the one pair of eyes that troubled to walk your fen, before they could teach the rest of the county to look. And you are far too late, for the corn is grown, and the field book is sworn, and no turning off of a companion in England can drain a truth back under the water now. The silence in the great hall was total. The late summer light lay gold along the flags, and no one moved. Sir Rowland Gaunt had gone the color of tallow, and his sharp hired attorney had leaned in and was murmuring something urgent and final in his ear, having plainly, all at once, smelled a hopeless brief and a client who had lied to him, and the 2 or 3 brought gentry had taken a small step apart from him. As men step back from one the crowd has turned upon, and cold Miss Sabina Gaunt looked, for the first time in the whole wretched business, not cold at all, but simply frightened. A young woman seeing the ground of her father's consequence, and her own, open under her feet. "This is a conspiracy of servants and drunkards," said Gaunt, but the roll had gone thin as ditch water, and no commission will credit a ruined scribbler and a scheming. But even he heard how it fell into the silence, and he did not finish it. He looked once round the ring of still faces and found not one to meet his eye. And he turned on his heel and went the length of the great hall and out at the door, upright still, but walking fast. His attorney a half-step behind him, already talking low about withdrawing from the cause, and the sound of his carriage going off down the avenue came back up between the walls of the house. And Margaret Ashworth stood in the enormous quiet with her hands folded and her heart going hard, and thought, with a strange calm, "Well, that is done. Now I shall be turned off in my turn. For a great house cannot easily keep the grey companion who shamed a baronet before the county." "Miss Ashworth," said the Duke of Aldermere, and it was the first time in 11 years that anyone in that house had said her name as though it were an honor, "will you come into the small library where it is quiet? There is a great deal I find I wish to say to you, and I had rather not shout it the length of my own hall before the household and the gaunts." He shut the door of the little book-lined room behind them, where the low gold light of the late afternoon fell across the shelves, and one tall window looked down the causeway to the far shine of the fen, and Margaret stood in the middle of it with her hands folded and waited to be thanked and pensioned off, and had her whole small speech ready, how she would go without fuss, how she asked only a character, that she might find some other place that wanted a plain woman who could read true ground. He offered her, first, money, a sum that made her sit down without meaning to. She refused it. He offered, next, to make her surveyor and keeper of the estate's lands and maps in name and in fact both, over any man of business in England, with a proper salary and rooms of her own and the freedom of the library for life. And this she did not refuse. But neither did she answer, because she could see in his face that it was not the thing he had brought her into the quiet room to say, and that he was working his way toward the true thing by the road of the easier ones. "Nicholas," she said then, more quietly. She had never used his name, and did not know she was going to, and the sound of it stopped him as though she had laid a flat hand on his chest. "There, I have said it, and the roof has not come down. Now say your piece plainly, your grace, and I will say mine, and let us neither of us be cowards about it, for I am too old to be courted round the houses, and you are too honest to enjoy the doing of it." So he said it, plainly, in the plain words they had both come to trust. "You stood in my hall not an hour since," he said, "and you would not let me defend you. Do you know why that undid me, when nothing in all my life has? Because I saw what you were doing. You saw, quicker than I did, that if I spent my name on you before the whole county, they would say you had bewitched me into it, and you would sooner take that man's filth full in the face and walk out onto the road without a character than let the defending of you cost me a shilling of my standing. A woman with nothing shielded a duke with everything, and meant to walk out of my life without so much as letting me thank her for it. And I stood there and understood, all at once, that in the whole of my guarded life I have never once been valued by a soul who wanted nothing from me, and that I was about to let her go back to reading another woman's maps. I am not offering you rank," he went on, and the level voice went for a moment unsteady. "Rank is nothing. It came to me out of 2 graves and very nearly cost me 1/3 of my land to a lie, because I was too well bred to go and look. I am offering you the only thing I have ever found worth the giving, a partnership of equals, in the plain sight of God, my name to yours, and my judgment laid open to your plain sense every day we both live. Spend what is left of our years keeping me honest, for there is no one else alive I would trust to try it, and I find I cannot go back to being flattered now that I have once been told the truth. You showed me the difference between being served and being told the truth, and a man cannot unknow that. and I will have no other woman in England but the one who taught it to me, standing in a wet field with her father's chain. Margaret Ashworth was 40 years old, and had prided herself her whole life on having no illusions, and discovered in that little room that she had nursed the largest illusion of all, the one that had told her since she was young and plain and poor that a woman like her was not permitted, by God or the world, to be simply and wholly loved for exactly what she was. "They will say I am a fortune hunter," she said, when she could speak. "They have said it for 11 years on no evidence at all. Marry me, and you hand them their proof. They will say it of me until I die. And some of them after, that the gray companion cried fraud to break your neighbor and creep into your bed, that she planned the whole of it from the first drowned acre, that you were gulled by a designing spinster twice as neatly as ever Sir Rowland gulled you. You know they will. You have lived among them." "I know them to the bone," he said, "and I do not care one straw for the opinion of people I do not respect, upon a matter they cannot understand, concerning the only happiness I have ever been offered. They will say the Duke of Aldermere married the woman who saw, with an old chain and 3 days' patience, the theft that the first improver in the county had hidden behind a wall of reed for 20 years, who gave me back 1/3 of my land and 100 families their bread and my dead father his good name, and who would have walked away and let them call her a schemer sooner than cost me a shilling of my pride. Let them say it. It is even true, every word." And he held out his hand to her, not a lord's hand offered to be kissed, but a plain hand, open, palm up, level, between equals. "Margaret, I have asked you a question. You have never in your life left an honest question unanswered to spare anyone's feelings. Do not begin now." And Margaret Ashworth, reader to the grandmother of the Duke of Aldermere, looked at the offered hand, and at the gray eyes that had learned, at 34, not to lie to her. And she gave him the truth, as she had given him nothing but the truth from the first hour, because the truth was the only dowry she had ever owned, and it turned out to be the only one he had ever wanted. "Yes," she said, "God help the pair of us." Yes, they were married in the small gray parish church at the causeway's end, within sight of the fen, quietly, in the first week of October, with the harvest in and the whole scandalized county watching from behind its curtains, and not one of it invited. Reuben Sedge gave the bride away, and thought his old heart would crack with the rightness of it. The fen reeve handing the surveyor's daughter to the Duke over the very ground they had measured true together. And Mrs. Pargeter, who had come to gape and stayed to be ashamed, wept through the service. And the old Dowager Duchess, the shrewdest champion of the match, was carried to the church in a chair, and told the whispering pews that her grandson had done the one wholly sensible thing of his life, in marrying the only person under his roof with eyes in her head and the courage to use them. And when the plain vows were said, the little church was so still they could hear the geese going over toward the drying fen, and more than one hard old tenant come to stare and stayed to be moved, said afterward that the silence when the gray reader became Duchess of Aldermere was that of a whole small world, quietly rearranging itself around a truth it had not seen coming. She never played the great lady, and never once tried to. She wore good plain gowns and no jewels, and kept her father's brass chain and his spirit level and his worn field book in her own writing table drawer, and went down to the map room most mornings to keep the estate's lands and rents true in her own hand. And the great fraud was carried whole before the commission and the bench, the false survey overthrown, and the true worth of the great fen restored to Aldermere. The reclaimed land came home to the estate that owned it. Its rich rents paid off in 3 good years the debts the young Duke had been ready to sell his birthright for. And the fen-edge families quietly starved these 20 years were given their due of the recovered ground, and throve. And Sir Rowland Gaunt, when the case was proved, and Quainton's field book sworn and his own hand shown moving the mark, found his 40 years of respected standing worth precisely nothing. He was put off the commission in disgrace, sued for 20 years of the fen's stolen profit, and broke under it, and went abroad a step ahead of worse, and died there shabby and disbelieved and small, which is a colder ruin than any prison. And his cold daughter Sabina, freed of her father's consequence and his schemes, married in her own time a plain, honest clergyman she chose, and said the Ashworth woman had done her the one great kindness of her life, though she never quite brought herself to say it to her face. She taught clever young women under her, craftsmen's and tenants' grown kinswomen with quick eyes and no prospects, to run a chain and read a level and cast an honest acre and know a true survey from a bought one, and never once be gulled by a fine plan with a great name in the corner. And she and the Duke were the most quietly contented couple in the shire. And his Grace, who had come into his title, grief hollowed and shut as a locked strong-box, grew into a man at ease in his own skin, who could laugh and be argued with over a rent of a morning, and looked at his unlikely Duchess across the breakfast table as though he could not quite believe his own good fortune, and never learned to take it for granted, which is the whole art of a long happiness. He lived another 30 years, and died at last in his own bed, his hand in her chain roughened one, and no stranger in the room. She sat with him at the end as she had stood over his stolen fen at the beginning, still and true, and told him the truth to the very last, which was that he had been a great deal of trouble and worth every hour of it. And he laughed his quiet laugh one final time and told her she was the one true thing he had ever been given, and slept and did not wake, and she closed his gray eyes herself and did not weep until the door was shut. She outlived him by 9 years and kept the estate's lands true to the end, and walked the dry green fen of a fine evening leaning on Reuben Sedge's grandson, who kept it after old Reuben was gone, and she was, by the time she followed her Duke, so beloved across that whole broad reach of fen country that they lined the droves for her funeral 3 deep. Tenants and marshmen and eel-catchers and the households of the women she had taught to run a chain, far more than ever lined them for any duke, and among them not a few of the fine folk who had once called her a fortune-hunter and lived long enough to be ashamed of it. And they carried behind her coffin, on a cushion, her father's brass measuring chain and his worn field book, which the whole fen country agreed was a stranger honor than any crest, and no more than her due. There is an old saying among the land measurers and fen-men of the low country, that the ground cannot lie, though every map that is drawn of it may, that a man with a bought pen may drown a good acre upon paper and dry a bog with a figure. But the land itself keeps its own reckoning under all of it, and water will find the true level in the end, whatever the plan may swear. And the whole art of an honest surveyor is to trust the ground before the paper. Margaret Ashworth read maps to an old woman at Aldermere for 11 years before a soul above the housekeeper troubled to learn her name, and for 30 years after as its duchess, and never once in all that time called a false thing true to spare a great person's feelings. She was not saved by her meekness, nor by her beauty, for she had neither. She was saved, if saved is the word for the woman who did the saving, by the plain, unfakeable fact of what she knew, and by the courage to stake everything she had upon it in a world forever dazzled by a great name and an improving gentleman's word, and a signed and sworn survey, and a man who in his day could drown a whole rich country upon paper and make the county thank him, for it had found there was one level in England he could never once make lie. and it was hers, and it made her the truest measure in the county. The fen-edged tenants whose bread she saved said it first, and the women she taught to run a true chain said it after. And in the fullness of years even the great folk who had scorned her came round to saying it too, until it was less an opinion than a fact of the country, worn smooth with the saying, that a plain grey-gowned woman with a surveyor's chain had walked out over a causeway one summer, and read through a fraud that the first improver in the shire had hidden behind a wall of reed for 20 years, and given a living duke back a third of his birthright and a dead one back his good name, and asked nothing for it at all. And it was said of her, long after, whenever a proud man was flattered toward his ruin, or a wise woman was overlooked for her plainness, that she had found with an old chain and 3 days' patience what a famous gentleman had staked his whole name was worthless beyond question, and it made her the truest measure in the county. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you are watching from and what this story made you feel. And if it moved you, consider subscribing softly so you won't miss the next one.